Stories stay with us over time, but does their meaning remain the same? This is the time to open an old bookshelf and breathe new life into the stories sleeping within the data. This is Folktales Retold. Once upon a time, in a deep, secluded mountain village untouched by the noise of the world, lived a kind-hearted woodcutter with his widowed mother. The place he lived was so lonely that the sound of the wind announcing the changing seasons and the chirping of unknown mountain birds were his only companions. His life consisted of waking up before dawn each day and silently shouldering a frame carrier. The weight of the wood pressing down on his spine was familiar, but the weight on his heart that came when darkness fell upon the valley never quite became so. The creaking of his carrier was his only companion, and the beads of sweat on his brow were the only proof that he was alive. He had his elderly mother, his only family in the world. At the end of a hard day's labor, when he saw the smoke rising from the kitchen fire his mother had lit over the ridge, the woodcutter found a small comfort and a reason to live, knowing there was a place for his weary steps to go. Sitting across from him at the dinner table, his mother would gaze at her son's face, weary from hard work and loneliness. With her wrinkled hands, she would place a side dish on his rice bowl and say softly, "My son, my last wish is to see you meet a good partner and live happily." Watching her son eat in silence, the mother's worries billowed up like the steam from the rice. Her greatest wish was to see her son's partner and hold a precious grandchild wrapped in a blanket before she closed her eyes. But the thought of which young maiden would come to marry into this desolate mountain village made her pity her son's plight, leading to many sleepless nights. That day, too, the woodcutter went up the mountain with a heavy heart, carrying his mother's worries on his back. Just as he powerfully lifted his axe, as if to shake off his troubled mind, that was the moment. Tearing through the quiet forest, a deer burst out from the bushes, its face showing it was at death's door, running for its life. Following close behind, a hunter with sharp eyes appeared, his bow already drawn. Like the tautly drawn bowstring, the forest air instantly froze. The deer, not having seen the hunter, looked at the woodcutter with its large, dark eyes, as if about to shed tears. It was a silent cry for help, more desperate than any words in the world. The moment he saw those pitiful eyes, the woodcutter, without a moment's hesitation, pointed to a pile of wood beside him. It was an instinctive act where compassion reacted before reason. Understanding the woodcutter's gesture, the deer used its last ounce of strength to throw itself into the woodpile. This desperate struggle for life vanished in an instant into the pile of leaves. Soon after, the hunter, running breathlessly, gasped and asked, "Hey, did you see a deer run this way?" The woodcutter, with a nonchalant expression, as if he knew nothing, pointed to the mountain ridge in the opposite direction from where the deer had run. The hunter, looking suspicious, glanced back and forth between the woodcutter's face and the woodpile, not letting go of his doubtful gaze. However, in his haste, he eventually swore and hurried off in the direction the woodcutter had pointed. Only after the hunter's footsteps had completely faded into the forest did the woodcutter's tense shoulders slump. He let out a long sigh of relief, and the fact that his small lie had saved a life seemed to fill a corner of his heart that had always felt empty. Just then, with a rustling sound from behind the woodpile, the deer cautiously poked its head out. Unlike before, when it was terrified, its eyes now seemed to hold a deep wisdom. But then, an unbelievable thing happened before the woodcutter's eyes. From the body of the deer, which he thought was just an ordinary animal, a soft, mystical light, as if holding the moonlight, began to emanate. In truth, the deer was not an ordinary animal, but a divine spirit from the heavens who had briefly descended to earth. The woodcutter was so astonished that he stood there blankly, forgetting even to drop the axe in his hand. The deer bowed its head deeply and spoke in a clear, dignified human voice. "I sincerely thank you for saving my life. To repay your warm heart, please tell me your lifelong wish. I will tell you how to achieve that wish." In that instant, the face of his mother and his desperate desire to find a partner flashed through the woodcutter's mind. As if reading his thoughts, the deer told him about a secret pond deep in the Nyungang Mountains, a place untouched by human feet. On the night of the full moon, heavenly fairies would descend there to bathe. "Hide one of the celestial robes the fairies take off," it said. "Then, one fairy will be unable to return to the sky, and will become your lifelong partner to soothe your loneliness. The deer's voice was like a sweet whisper, digging into the woodcutter's deepest desires. Having promised to grant the woodcutter's wish, the deer lowered its voice and added a very important warning. However, you must keep this one thing in mind. Until you have 3 children, you must never, under any circumstances, show the celestial robe to your wife. If you break this promise, all the happiness you have painstakingly gained will disappear like a bubble. With those final words, the deer vanished with the light, and silence once again filled the forest. The woodcutter stood there for a long time as if rooted to the spot. Was this an opportunity given to him, weary of his terrible loneliness? Or was it a dangerous test he couldn't handle? But in his heart, sweet hope and a chilling fear began to churn violently. A few days later, the night of the full moon finally arrived, brightly illuminating the entire mountain as if it were daytime. After much deliberation, the woodcutter, having made up his mind, clutched the map the deer had given him and, calming his trembling heart, climbed the rugged mountain path. The pouring moonlight was his only guide. After walking for a long time, a mystical pond appeared before his eyes as if by magic. In the pitch-black darkness, the water's surface, fully embracing the moonlight, shone serenely like a well-polished silver tray. The woodcutter hid behind a large rock and held his breath, afraid that the sound of his own heart would break the silence. Thump, bump, thump. As he tried to calm his wildly beating heart, how long had he waited? At the end of a wait that felt like an eternity, that was the moment. From the center of the quiet night sky, a brilliant 5-colored beam of light descended like a rainbow, illuminating the center of the pond. The pond water, receiving the light, sparkled brilliantly like a gem that emits its own light. The woodcutter couldn't close his mouth at the sight, a spectacle that made him doubt his own eyes. Riding down the pillar of light were the heavenly fairies he had only heard about in stories, descending one by one to the earth. It was so dreamlike and unreal that he was confused as to whether he was even alive. Reaching the edge of the pond, the fairies took off their celestial robes, their wings for flying, and their only means of returning home, as if handling their most precious treasures, and placed them neatly on a rock. Every single movement was imbued with an elegance that could not be of this world. Soon the pond was filled with the fairies' clear laughter and the sound of splashing water. It was a heavenly scene itself, with no trace of earthly worries or concerns. Watching the scene, the woodcutter almost forgot his own plan for a moment. The woodcutter, who had been watching everything with bated breath, finally came to his senses and fixed his gaze on the nearest celestial robe. It was a moment of choice that would completely change his life and the fate of a fairy. He swallowed dryly and carefully reached out his hand. At last, the woodcutter's trembling hand grasped the celestial robe. The fabric that touched his fingertips was unbelievably soft and cool, unlike anything from the human world. He tried to ignore what consequences this small act would bring. He held the stolen robe to his chest and hid behind the rock again. He knew in his head that this was an irreversible wrong, an endlessly selfish act, but the desire to escape his dreadful loneliness suppressed his conscience. After a while, the fairies, having finished their bathing, put on their celestial robes one by one and began to fly back up to the sky. In the place they left, only the echo of laughter, and one fairy who could not return to the sky remained. Realizing all her friends had left, the fairy discovered that her celestial robe was gone. At first, she thought it was just a mischievous prank, but when she couldn't find her robe no matter how much she searched, the smile vanished from her face and a cold fear began to rise. The moment she realized her way back to the sky was completely blocked, thick teardrops fell endlessly from the fairy's eyes. It wasn't just sadness over losing a piece of clothing. It was the despair of losing everything that was her reason for being, her home, her family, in an instant. As the fairy's sorrowful cries echoed through the forest, the woodcutter appeared from behind the rock with an innocent expression, as if he knew nothing. Behind his back, the lie that he had staked his life on was hidden. Startled by the sudden presence, the fairy looked at the strange man with eyes full of fear. To her, who had lived cut off from the world, a human was an unknown being and fear itself. The woodcutter quietly approached, took off his outer coat, and wrapped it around the fairy's shoulders. The night is deep, and the mountain is very cold. I don't know what has happened, but you will catch a terrible illness like this. First, please come to my house." In his gentle voice, a dark intention he couldn't reveal was hidden. Realizing she had no other choice, that she was completely alone in this strange land, the fairy lost all hope and silently lowered her head. She did not yet know that this strange man's kindness was actually a snare to imprison her. And so the woodcutter led the weeping fairy along the moonlit mountain path to his thatched roof house. It was the moment a man's desperate wish led to a fairy's lifelong tragedy. Behind him, the pond that connected to the sky grew farther and farther away. The fairy, now staying at the woodcutter's house, would gaze endlessly at the sky every night from the darkness of the unfamiliar world. The distant moon was the only face she knew, but it was also a cruel landmark that reminded her of the home she could not return to. The longing for her family and friends was densely embedded in her heart like the stars in the night sky, painfully piercing her every night. The woodcutter's mother, however, treated the grieving fairy as her own daughter, caring for her devotedly. She would hold the fairy's cold hands with her own wrinkled ones, sharing her warmth. That gentle comfort became the first spark that breathed a tiny bit of warmth into the frozen heart of the fairy, who had been thrown alone into a strange land. The woodcutter hid the stolen celestial robe in a chest deep in the storeroom and developed a habit of checking it secretly every night. Whenever a small smile bloomed on the fairy's face, he felt as happy as if he owned the world. But when he faced the radiant light his lie emitted in the dark barn, a heavy guilt pressed down on his shoulders like a rock. As time went by, the fairy gradually opened her heart to the sincere care of the woodcutter and his mother, and eventually they were married. Although it wasn't as splendid as a celestial wedding, the old mother's eyes were filled with tears of joy as she watched the two bow to each other, her lifelong wish fulfilled. And not long after, a beautiful baby boy was born to them. The moment she held her own child in her arms for the first time, the fairy discovered a new love that was deeply rooted in the earth, entirely different from her longing for the sky. The baby's tiny breath became the strongest reason for her to live on this land, and the sound of the baby's laughter became the warmest presence that filled the once empty, thatched house. Looking at his wife and child, the woodcutter believed that his deceitful beginning had blossomed into such brilliant happiness, he now envied nothing in the world. And as another year passed, a beautiful daughter was born. The fairy was now a mother of two. Instead of the freedom of flying in the sky, she learned to walk on the earth holding her children's hands, and it seemed as if she was being completely reborn as a woman of the earth. The life of the woodcutter, the fairy, and their two children was perfectly happy, and it seemed that the longing for the sky and the guilt over the stolen celestial robe were all melting away in this peaceful and sweet time. The woodcutter now lived forgetting the deer's warning as if it were a story from a very long time ago. But one rainy night, when he had become too accustomed to happiness, it happened. Listening to the sound of the rain hitting the papered window, the fairy suddenly recalled distant memories of walking on the clouds. While feeling endless love looking at her sleeping children's faces, a fundamental longing she thought she had forgotten, wondering where was the place I originally belonged, began to seep into her heart like rainwater. Unable to overcome her uncontrollable longing, the fairy tearfully appealed to the woodcutter, who was making straw sandals beside her. "Husband, I have one wish in my life. That celestial robe I wore from the sky. I want to see it again, just once. Just once, please. Can't you show it to me?" The fairy's heart-wrenching plea shook the woodcutter's heart mercilessly. In his ears, the divine deer's warning, "Absolutely not until you have 3 children," rang like thunder, but before his eyes, his beloved wife's desperate tears flowed like a river. He stood at the most difficult crossroads of his life. The woodcutter looked at the faces of his 2 peacefully sleeping children. Yes, she is a mother of 2 now. Surely she wouldn't leave these little ones behind and go to the sky alone, he thought. And he decided to believe in his wife's maternal love and the power of the love they had built together. He didn't know that this belief would become the most foolish trap to ensnare him. In the end, the woodcutter, completely unaware that it would be a decision he would regret for the rest of his life, nodded with a smile as if to reassure his wife. "All right, wife, since you wish to see it so much, I will show it to you just once." "Really? Just once?" The woodcutter went to the barn and opened the heavy lid of the chest, which was covered in a thick layer of dust. With a creaking sound, the secret and guilt he had tried so hard to bury and the prelude to an unstoppable tragedy were opened together. Even in the dark barn, the celestial robe emitted a brilliant light, as if it were the moonlight itself. It was a piece of the sky itself, something that could not be replicated by any silk on earth. The moment she saw the celestial robe, tears of mixed joy and sorrow streamed down the fairy's face, as if she had found the lost half of herself. With trembling hands, she stroked the celestial robe as if caressing an old friend. "Just once," she whispered. "I will wear it just once." As if possessed, the fairy put on the celestial robe. The moment the robe touched her body, she remembered the forgotten touch of the sky, the scent of the clouds, the song of the wind. And at that very moment, the celestial robe perfectly remembered its owner. Regardless of the fairy's will, her body began to defy gravity and float into the air on its own. The happy memories on earth began to lose their power before the irresistible instinct towards the sky. The fairy looked at her children, who had just woken up. She did not hesitate between her earthly love and her heavenly instinct. She took her own flesh and blood, whom she could not leave behind on this earth, one in each arm. "Farewell, husband." Before the woodcutter could desperately reach out, the fairy with her 2 children shot through the roof and up into the night sky. The deer's warning had become a reality, and the castle of happiness built on the woodcutter's foolish belief crumbled in an instant. In the empty room where his wife and children had disappeared, all that remained was a large hole in the ceiling. The woodcutter stared blankly at the cold moon visible through the hole. He had never once imagined that the price of his foolish trust would be so tragic. Regret and despair overwhelmed his entire body at once. The woodcutter ran outside like a madman and shouted at the top of his lungs towards the shrinking figure of his wife. "Honey, children, please come back. It was my fault." But his voice scattered into the empty air, never reaching the sky. Eventually, he collapsed helplessly on the ground and wept sorrowfully like a child. The result of his selfish act to escape loneliness was a deeper, more terrible loneliness than ever before. He had ruined everything with his own hands. The thunderous news threw the old mother into a state of shock, as if the sky had fallen. She had lost her much-desired daughter-in-law and her precious grandchildren, dearer than her own eyes, in an instant. The mother couldn't bring herself to blame her son. She could only hold him and weep together. From that day on, the woodcutter stopped working and wandered around the pond where he had first met the fairy every day. He clung to the vain hope that perhaps the fairy would come down again, that a miracle might happen. But the pond remained just quiet. Then one day, as he was giving up all hope, the divine deer appeared before him again. This time, the light emanating from the deer's body was not mystical but seemed full of pity for the foolish human. The woodcutter knelt before the deer and begged, "I was foolish. I ruined everything. Please help me meet my wife and children just one more time." The deer sighed deeply and said, "It is water already spilled, and the will of heaven that cannot be defied. But since your tears and regret are so deep, I will give you one last chance." The deer told him that when a bucket lowered from the sky touched the ground, he could ride it up to the celestial kingdom. A rope connecting heaven and earth, it was the last lifeline given to the woodcutter. When the bucket finally descended from the sky, the woodcutter grabbed it without a moment's hesitation. As the ground receded beneath his feet and he was pulled up into the distant sky, he held onto the single thought of wanting to see his wife and children again. After ascending for a long time, the woodcutter finally arrived in the celestial kingdom, a place he could never have imagined on earth. Palaces made of clouds and bridges connected by rainbows, everything was mystical and beautiful. But in his eyes, only the images of his wife and children flickered. Finally, the woodcutter was reunited with his wife and children. They embraced each other and wept for a long time, their tears a mixture of joy and sorrow. The joy of reunion was as great as the pain of their time apart. The children giggled with delight upon seeing their father. Life in the celestial kingdom with his family was like a dream. However, as time passed, a corner of the woodcutter's heart began to be filled with worry and longing for his elderly mother left alone on earth. No matter how happy he was, a part of his heart always felt empty. Eventually, the woodcutter said to his wife, "I miss my mother so much. Please let me go down to Earth to see her just once and come back." The fairy, knowing her husband's deep filial piety, could only nod with sad eyes. The fairy gave him a celestial dragon horse and urged her husband, "If you ride this horse, you can go to Earth and back in an instant. However, no matter what happens, you must never get off the horse. The moment your feet touch the ground, you will never be able to return to the sky." Riding the dragon horse, the woodcutter arrived at his longed-for home in the blink of an eye. His elderly mother, who thought her son was dead, couldn't hide her tears of joy upon seeing him descend from the sky. The two embraced and caught up for a long time. The mother brought a warm pumpkin porridge, her son's favorite, but the woodcutter could not get off the horse because of his wife's warning. "I'm sorry, mother. I cannot get off this horse." The mother, wanting to feed her son at least one bowl of porridge, anxiously fidgeted. At that very moment, tragedy struck. In her haste, the mother's hand slipped, and the hot pumpkin porridge spilled onto the dragon horse's back. The startled dragon horse neighed and reared up, and in the process, the woodcutter fell off the horse and tumbled to the ground. The riderless dragon horse instantly flew up into the sky and disappeared into a dot. Or the woodcutter, whose feet had touched the ground, the last path back to the sky was severed. Once again, he had lost everything with his own hands. After that, the woodcutter lived his entire life on Earth, gazing at the sky and longing. His only son having become a broken man, the mother fell ill with grief and eventually passed away. Unable to overcome his longing for the sky, the woodcutter died and became a rooster. That is why even now, roosters climb to high places like rooftops and crow their hearts out towards the sky, hoping perhaps that their cries might reach their beloved family in the distant celestial kingdom. The story ends here, but the resonance left by the story will now be refreshed in your heart. We ask for your small interest and will see you again with folk tales from all over the world found within the data. Please look forward to the next story.